There were times during development that, certainly reasonable voices on the team who were saying we should cut the Elizabeth character. It's just too complicated. I felt that if we cut Elizabeth, there's no point in doing the game. There wasn't, I didn't really know what the game was without Elizabeth.
2013 was a landmark year for gaming. The last year of the industry's 7th generation saw the release of numerous critically acclaimed titles that would forever change the way we perceived the medium. Among these endlessly revered games, my favorite is the one that takes place in the clouds. Irrational's BioShock Infinite puts players in the shoes of Booker DeWitt as he seeks to clear his debts by going to the skybound city of Columbia and rescuing a woman named Elizabeth. Of course, Booker's plans don't go as expected, and Infinite plunges you into a world of prophecy, revolution, and quantum mechanics that explore the unlimited possibilities of the BioShock universe. Today, on the eve of Infinite's 10th anniversary, you're going to learn about its history and development, about its roadblocks and its triumphs. And I'm very proud to tell you that you'll be hearing about these things from none other than Infinite's creative director, Ken Levine, as I had the chance to talk with him about the making of Infinite and how he approached Irrational's biggest game ever. This is BioShock Infinite, 10 years later.
Yeah, I'm Ken Levine. Then I was the president, creative director of Irrational Games, and I was the creative director on BioShock Infinite, which meant I sort of was like the director of a film. I sort of was the guy who had to communicate to the team what the game was and work with them to give them feedback on all aspects of the game. As well, I was the lead writer too and directed most of the acting in it, especially the Booker and Elizabeth stuff.
In 2007, gamers were introduced to Rapture, the city beneath the sea. BioShock was a monumental success for Irrational Games, who had previously worked on System Shock 2, Tribe's Vengeance, and SWAT 4. Within a year of its release, BioShock would sell over 3 million copies across all platforms, and was responsible for a soar in the stock prices of publisher Take-Two. A sequel was inevitable, but was also the subject of many internal discussions over what it would be and who would make it.
It took a little while. It sort of went back and forth. There's sort of a difference of view of what 2K wanted out of a sequel and what we wanted out of a sequel, creatively. It went back and forth, and eventually, after maybe many months, it was sort of determined that they would do BioShock 2 in Marin, and we would do, whatever that sequel was after that. I was upset because there was a difference of opinion about what the next game should be, because we had said as a team, at least from my perspective, we had told the story of Rapture. It seemed the option would be either to go earlier or go later, and I didn't really see anything later. I kind of saw that at the end of the story, the end of Rapture.
2K's impulse and mandates for BioShock 2 would ultimately help Infinite, as Infinite wouldn't have to be so derivative of the first game to fulfill the expectations of an immediate sequel. So, where did Infinite begin? The game takes place in Columbia, not Rapture, and unlike BioShock 2, which goes forward in the timeline, Infinite went backwards.
It really started with a time period. The Sun Opportunity, I didn't see a lot of games set in that era. Sometimes you see very few World War I games, and you see a lot of World War II stuff, but, there's not much set in between the 1890s and 1910.
BioShock Infinite was always set at the turn of the 20th century. However, its first iteration was much different aesthetically than the final product. Influenced heavily by Art Nouveau, an ornamental art style originating from Europe, this version of Infinite was more closely aligned with the horror atmosphere of BioShock 1, and saw similar but altered elements from the game, such as flying Big Daddies. The game's world was jokingly referred to in the studio as Flapture, because the only difference between it and Rapture was that it was in the sky. This version of Infinite was determined to be too much like BioShock 1, and Irrational sought a change in art direction that would make Infinite more distinct. Like the first BioShock, Infinite's inspirations are rooted in history and literature. As the team worked on Flapture, a book was being passed around the studio called The Devil in the White City, which told the story of two very different men. The first, an architect who would build the Chicago World's Fair in 1893, and the second, a serial killer who would use the fair to find his victims. The Chicago World's Fair of 1893 is also known as the World's Columbian Exposition, at the time celebrating the 400th anniversary of Christopher Columbus's arrival to the New World. The Columbian Exposition was a look into the future for many living in the 1890s. It was the first World's Fair powered entirely by electricity, a spectacle that many people hadn't experienced yet. The fair was navigated by traversing its seascape. Its architects used canals to create artificial islands that you had to get into gondolas to reach. Unfortunately, the fair was also a product of its time regarding discrimination due to skin color. Despite obtaining their freedom 30 years prior thanks to the Emancipation Proclamation issued by President Lincoln, African Americans were only allowed low-level jobs as fair staff and were actively denied positions on the fair's committees. It's worth noting that the previous World's Fair in 1889 was held in Paris, France, and saw the unveiling of the Eiffel Tower. With a renewed vision of what their new game could look like, Irrational began a great process of overhauling to bring it to life. But could this new game that was rapidly evolving be constructed with their current workforce? BioShock was built by around 60 people, but it would end up taking over 200 to realize Infinite.
And with BioShock Infinite, I think I just came and I said, what do you think of this? And we start moving in a certain direction, and then you start planning and planning more and more, and eventually you realize, oh shit, we're going to need, some more people here. But usually you realize it kind of like in process and quite often too late. If the industry is guilty of one thing, it is we're often guilty of optimism. It's hard to contemplate how long these games are to make. And so you're always kind of like undercutting yourself. And it's also just look at technology is really hard to plan for.
Irrational's previous 3 titles, including the first BioShock, were developed in Unreal Engine 2.5, an enhanced version of Unreal Engine 2. Irrational's engineers and programmers initially proposed building Infinite in the same engine, though they later came to the conclusion that the new Unreal Engine 3 would be better suited for the game they wanted to create.
It can be very scary to work on a relatively new version of the Unreal Engine. We had worked on the Dark Engine for System Shock 2, and we had worked on Unreal Engine and LitTech at one point, and it's always a pain in the ass. So we were sort of hesitant to move over, but eventually I think the outdoor game aspect of it, the outdoor setting, sort of pushed us over, and the draw distances, I think, put us over the top, that we had to have something that would render those kind of scenes.
With a setting and an engine, Irrational had to focus on what they wanted to achieve with Infinite. For Ken Levine, making a sequel with slight tweaks and improvements to the original BioShock was unappealing. Infinite would need its own draws, things that would set it apart not just from Irrational's other games, but the industry as a whole. This desire would manifest itself most prominently in how Infinite would approach the concept of a companion character.
I'm very interested in character. If you look at BioShock, sort of compared to a lot of other shooters, and System Shock as well, System Shock 2 as well, and even Thief, I had always made very character-oriented games. And we had done that in BioShock, in terms of we had a bunch of interesting characters, but they weren't really present with you. Every time you saw, you see Atlas for a minute, and you see Tenenbaum a couple of times, but honestly, they're just redressed splicer models. So I had all these great characters that I loved writing and loved doing, but they were really constrained to sort of cutscenes in the distance. Even Andrew Ryan was, just constrained to that one cutscene. I wanted to have a character you could really interact with to a greater degree.
Since early development, Infinite had a player character and a companion. These would eventually become Booker and Elizabeth, though Elizabeth took a much longer time to figure out given the impact she would have on the game and the uncharted territory she proposed conceptually.
And so Elizabeth was an opportunity. I hadn't really seen somebody create a companion character that went through broad character evolution over time. In that way, she really goes from, this sort of innocent, protected creature to, at one point in the game, she's like 83 years old and, and megalomaniacal. And then, then the other version of her that learns who she really is. And, I always love those sort of character arcs that take character from A to Z.
Elizabeth would become Infinite's greatest technical investment, necessitating many systems unique to her so she could be brought to life and believably interact with the player and her surroundings. Elizabeth existed as early as Flapture, though this was a very different version of the character. She didn't speak, and she was very reserved, something that quickly changed as the game's art direction shifted. Elizabeth saw the largest amount of design iteration of any character in the game, and it eventually became clear that the creation of Elizabeth could not be handled in a conventional manner. Typically in game development, different teams still handle multiple tasks regarding their own disciplines. Animators will work on animations for all characters, and programmers will code systems that are used across the entire game. Elizabeth, however, presented such an undertaking that a group of developers were relieved of their responsibilities regarding other aspects of the game to focus entirely on Elizabeth. Internally, this group was dubbed the Liz Squad. The Liz Squad would go on to create a unique and incredibly robust skeletal rig for Elizabeth, her cloth physics, custom shaders, and a character model with nearly 3 times the polygon count of the game's average NPC. Elizabeth observes, she interacts, and she moves with the player. Elizabeth evolved and survived numerous cuts because she was the centerpiece of the game. But what would all of the work put into her mean if the player didn't like her?
But that was a lot of conversations. We had a lot of conversations about how do you make a player give a shit about a fictional, effectively low polygon, cartoon character. There's things she could do in the story that you can make you care. We have to understand what her hopes and dreams were. That's why we very early set up her goal that she wanted to get out of that tower and go to Paris. Eventually the player, starts off and is trying to keep her from that. But then, eventually we hope the player is going to be rooting for her to get that.
Another issue that presented itself with Elizabeth was the potential for all of the technical and narrative effort behind her going down the tubes if the player resented her as a gameplay entity. BioShock Infinite was still a first-person shooter, and Irrational had to find a way for Elizabeth to be with the player at all times without being a hindrance.
One of the ways we achieved that is Elizabeth was helpful to you. We had another rule, which is she can never be a burden to you in the game. She'd never have to protect her. We had made different protection missions and stuff like that. Like in BioShock, there's this protection mission, and they're never fun. And I thought I had some clever trick to get around it not being fun, but it wasn't good enough. And so I was like, never again. We had to step back from it and say, okay, well, what does the experience with her feel like in combat? And then we try to push in the other direction. What if she helped you? What if essentially she helped protect you? And that seemed much more appealing in terms of making the player care about Elizabeth. We could make Booker protect her in sort of the narrative where it made sense. But I also like the idea that he wasn't, they were each other's saviors, In the narrative, you'd sort of put yourself out for her, and in the gameplay, she would often put herself out for you.
Of course, one of the ways Elizabeth was incorporated into Infinite's gameplay would end up becoming one of its most memorable and celebrated mechanics.
Booker, catch! Much obliged!
The Booker catch thing, you'd be in combat, you run out of ammo, and she would toss you a resupply. That felt like something out of a movie, and it's how you show people coming together, right? They become a fluid team. There was a lot of trickery to make that feel right. When we played around with, originally she'd say, Booker, an icon would come up, and you'd have to turn and sort of find her in the world, and you're looking around for these pixels while people are shooting at you, and then you'd have to point at her, and then hit the B button or whatever, and then she'd toss it to you, and you have to catch it, and then you'd have to reload. And essentially we just realized it was a glorified reload. We didn't need all those extra skill steps because the moment was really about making you feel like a team, not a reflex challenge to make you catch a gun that Elizabeth throws to you.
With over a year of development, BioShock Infinite was announced on August 12th, 2010. Many will note that this trailer and the game's 2011 E3 demo feature many differences from the game that came out. What happened to these versions of Infinite? And what happened to all of Elizabeth's different powers?
It was basically, we ran out of time to do. We would have done a lot more with her. Those ideas would have worked if we had implemented them. I knew the next thing was going to take a long time. I didn't want people saying, why the fuck hasn't, why is he keeping BioShock from us? We really underestimated how long it was going to take. I mean, I think you can tell I have not, until very, very recently, we showed nothing about our new game. That was added a lot of stress and strain, and it frustrated people because we showed stuff that ended up not working out. There's a lot of reasons things happen in development that you don't always get all the things you want. I really love the sequence in the, in that store.
Hey, Booker. 77 years ago.
Keep looking, Lincoln.
And it just didn't happen. It's a shame because I thought the sequence was really cool.
BioShock Infinite is one of the most well-documented games when it comes to content that was shifted around or ultimately cut from the final release. This is because its development was one of painstaking and scrutinous iteration to ensure that Irrational was putting out the best possible product for gamers. Because Irrational had to take on so many employees to make the game, the company's structure ballooned, and managerial issues arose that overwhelmed Ken Levine and the rest of Irrational's management.
When you don't know half the people in the studio, that's a real management challenge. My skill is not management, I'm a good writer and pretty good creative game developer. One of my strengths is I can see the game as the gamer would see it, even when I've been working on a thing for like months and months and months. And that's one of the hardest things for game developers. You just get too close to the work. And it's not because you're not trying, it's because you keep trying and you keep not liking what you see. And you're like, well, we could ship this, I guess. If you have a team that's honest with themselves, they'll tell you this isn't what it can be, because at the end of the day, it's got to be as polished and as fun as a game that we love from a different developer. You can't treat it with kid gloves because it's yours.
All of this was happening while the game was still in very active development, when aspects of the game could change month to month, rendering large amounts of work unusable.
I think the biggest issue with Infinite is that because the game ended up being effectively much earlier in development than we thought it was. We went in a bunch of different directions in some cases, and then some cases we failed to achieve certain of the objectives of things we had thought we could do. Like the biggest thing that I think was missing, I really think being just hanging out with Elizabeth and going through places and having her comment on things, we could have done that if we had. We just didn't get that done. And I think that was within reach. I think that would have added a lot of value to the game. Just hanging out with her, like the scene where you play guitar, when we did a little interaction and a little scripting and a little scene. And I thought it was one of my favorite parts of the game. And it was so, it really felt connected to her. And I wish we had done less of everything else and more of that.
A year from its final release date, and many at Irrational were unsure of how BioShock Infinite was going to ship at all. At that point, the game existed as a disconnected series of areas and even had 2 multiplayer modes in the works. In order to bring the game together as cohesively as possible, help from outside Irrational was brought in the form of producers Don Roy and Rod Ferguson. Ferguson was personally brought in by Levine. He was a producer on every Gears of War and had a reputation for slashing any and all features that would unnecessarily complicate development. BioShock 2's creative director, Jordan Thomas, also joined the team and worked directly with Ken to create a roadmap for the game's development. There was finally a clear path forward, and Irrational was unified. Infinite's multiplayer modes were scrapped, and the team focused on the single player. There were still many elements of the story that had to be figured out before the team could commit to developing those sections of the game. And that finally brings us to Schrödinger's cat. Schrödinger's cat is a thought experiment that illustrates a paradox in our understanding of quantum mechanics. Essentially, a cat is placed into a box with a trap that has a 50% chance of killing it and a 50% chance of doing nothing. If you cover up the box and return a day later, because the cat has an equal chance of being alive or dead, it is both alive and dead at the same time. Both possibilities exist as a quantum superposition, and it's not until we actually open the box and see the cat's state that reality sets in. If the cat is alive, we've created an alternate universe where it's dead, and vice versa. Now, you may be thinking, what does any of this have to do with BioShock Infinite? Well, have you ever wondered where the game's twist came from?
We went back and forth in that story for a lot. It was a very complicated story to break. And we went back and forth, and Daisy Fitzroy was involved, and we went back and forth on a whole bunch of things. And eventually, we came with the whole plot of Booker selling Elizabeth. I was very interested in this notion of, the sort of Schrödinger's cat thought experiment. I got interested in that story, and I was like, well, what is sort of what is the literature version of that story? In a first-person shooter video game, of the same man doing the same terrible thing in his past. I'm talking about the Wounded Knee Massacre, and how the same man might react to that, either by becoming this, messianic religious figure in one case, or becoming, a degenerate, broken, alcoholic gambler, who sells his daughter, to get out of his gambling debt. Could there be a story of redemption?
Use Zachary Comstock. Use Booker DeWitt.
No. I'm both.
The ending of Infinite is its most infamous moment, but it's also an ending that speaks to the journey that Infinite takes its characters on.
So with Booker and Elizabeth, it became a story about, these two characters, both of whom weren't really sure of the nature of themselves. And through this process together, they learn what they both are, and they reach some kind of conclusions to their narrative arcs through each other.
You may also have wondered, why does Infinite only have one ending? BioShock has 3 endings, BioShock 2 has 6, but Infinite only has one, and no decisions you can make throughout the game to influence the ending you get. There's 2 answers to this. The first is that BioShock's multiple endings were a publisher mandate. While 2K was very hands-off the development of the first game, the one thing they did ask for were multiple endings, and at the time, Irrational obliged. The second answer is one of design philosophy.
So I felt that until I have a solution about agency, I'm not going to pretend I do. We did a couple of things that didn't really work, like the bird, choosing the bird in the cage and things like that. They didn't really go anywhere. And as we worked on the game, or as we didn't have a fundamental design that would support real agency, I just wasn't interested in making the story pretend that the game had it.
BioShock Infinite released on March 26th, 2013. The Irrational offices on release day were full of celebration and relief. Just a year prior, they were figuring out how the game was even going to ship, but they managed to pull it off. Infinite would go on to win several Game of the Year awards and sell over 4 million copies in just 3 months. After the game's release, many developers at Irrational said their goodbyes to the studio, and others took well-deserved vacations. Those that stayed would begin concepting the game's DLC that would release over the course of the next year. During the ending of Infinite, Elizabeth opened a tear to Rapture. Infinite's story expansion, Burial at Sea, would make good on the promise of seeing Andrew Ryan's paradise once again.
The ending of Infinite came fairly late, and figuring out the whole thing with the, Sea of Lighthouses, and originally it was okay, this is very much a BioShock game, it's thematically tied together, and I knew I wanted to bring Rapture to it in some way, but not in a way you'd expect. At some point, it just sort of popped up, and it was like, well, all of a sudden it makes a lot of sense, and also sort of gives more shape to the mini world stuff.
Burial at Sea enjoyed a very healthy pre-production process, and did not see the same degree of harsh iteration as the base game. Initially, some at Irrational believed that assets from BioShock 1 would hold up, and that they could be reused to depict Rapture in this DLC. They quickly realized that the assets did not, so Rapture had to be rebuilt from the ground up. The final product was a jaw-dropping look at the underwater city just before its decline. Also jaw-dropping was Elizabeth's new design. Elizabeth was redesigned to fit the style of the new world she inhabited. Burial at Sea Episode 1 would release on November 12th, 2013, just 8 months after the release of Infinite. At a breakneck pace, Irrational began working on Episode 2, which would come out on March 25th, 2014. The ending of Episode 2 is heartbreaking, though it's a perfect and fitting end to Irrational's journey with the BioShock franchise.
I was happy with, I thought I was ending it the right way. I thought I had said everything I needed to say about it. I didn't really have any other ideas. I still, to this day, if you asked me what I would do with another BioShock game, I still couldn't tell you.
In 364 days, Irrational Games would release their largest game ever, 2 acclaimed DLCs, and then cease to exist. A month prior to Burial at Sea Episode 2's release, Ken Levine stated that he was dissolving the company in order to begin a new project with no more than 15 members of Irrational's current staff. The Irrational employees that weren't moving over were given financial support and allowed time to put their portfolios together. They were also offered the chance to speak with other Take-Two studios for positions at different companies. A job fair was even held to make sure that everyone found work quickly. By the end of 2014, Irrational Games was no more. The story behind BioShock Infinite is a beautifully complicated one. In many ways, it embodies the very essence of game development. There are hardships and compromise, but also countless irreplaceable moments of individual and collaborative creativity. It's rare when a studio's last game is a great one, and even more rare for that game to still resonate with players a decade after its release. Infinite is my favorite BioShock game, and is as human as the people who made it.
I had, many positive experiences. My life was really changed by making BioShock, and especially, it was the first game that a lot of people played, and I would frequently meet people who had played, my work, and that's all you really ever want as an artist. It's nice to have people experience it, right? You want to have an impact on people's lives, and so I'm very grateful to the fact that, I got to make something in my life that a lot of people experienced.
Thanks for watching.